Good evening, or good noon, I guess, for you. Uh, okay, so we'll continue. We'll do a brief review over what we've done. So I'm reminding you that this class, the quest for the test, for the text, involves three B's. If you remember, we're going to learn more about the Bible. We're going to try to enrich our knowledge about different textual versions of the Bible. So that was one goal. The second goal, we said we're going to talk about battles surrounding the biblical texts, mainly battles between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And finally, we're going to talk about the shift from traditional to biblical approaches, critical approaches to the biblical text. So far, I promised, but we only done the first B. We mainly spoke about the Bible, and we learned about two important versions of the Bible. We started by talking about what is text witnesses, the physical copies of the Bible, and then we spoke about the important textual versions of the Bible. We started with the Jewish prevailing version of the Bible, meaning the Masoretic text, and we described all of its features, characteristics, and we spoke a little bit about the theories that surrounded that type of text. Then we moved on and we spoke about the Septuagint, which is the common text, the governing text of the Bible in antiquity among Christians. Today we'll move on one step further. So after we spoke about the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, and we're going to start with the second B. We're going to finally reach our battles. Today will be devoted, today's class will be devoted essentially to the Jewish-Christian debate, because we're going to keep talking about the Masoretic text and the Septuagint and talk about the type of differences that are visible when you compare these two versions of the Bible. And we'll start also addressing the battles that surrounded this text, the Jewish-Christian battle over the Bible. In next week's session, we'll introduce Islam, and we'll talk about the Islamic perspective on this, which is a little bit less known, but I think just as important. But today, again, we're going to deal mainly with Jews and Christians. So we're starting from where we ended up last week. Last week, we spoke about the Masoretic text and about the Septuagint, and I wanted to start talking about something about the comparison between these two versions of the Bible, comparing the Masoretic text and the Septuagint. So as we said before, the Masoretic text and the Septuagint are different, not in a small number of variants, but we're talking about thousands and thousands of differences that separate these two versions of the Bible. If we wish, we can talk about two types of differences that distinguish these two textual versions. The first type we can call neutral differences. What are neutral differences? This is my definition. You don't have to follow that particular formulation, but neutral differences would be differences that do not involve in any way something that involves these two, the Jewish or Christian religion. It doesn't reflect in any way the fact that Masoretic text is Jewish and the Septuagint is a text that was used by Christians. These are just neutral differences that separate these two versions of the Bible. And I want to bring you one example for this type of neutral differences. When we look in Genesis 2:1, in the story of the creation, so we see the following verse. It reads, I'm sure you know this verse, Vayechal Elohim bayom hashvi'i melachto asher asa, vayishbot bayom hashvi'i mikol melachto asher asa. Or in English, and on the seventh day, God finished his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. So this is what the text is saying. And there's an obvious problem that emerges when you read this text. What's the problem? On the seventh day, God finished his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day. What's the obvious problem? And not too many of us. So
well, was he working or resting on the seventh
right.
day?
Usually work and rest don't go together. So you either work or rest. So how could God both finish his work on the seventh day and at the same time rest on the seventh day? So Jewish commentators struggle with this verse. One interesting idea that Rashi brings also is that perhaps what it says that God finished his work or his creation, it doesn't mean that he actually created something new in a physical sense, but perhaps God on the seventh day created the concept of rest. So that's the end of the creation. It's a beautiful idea, but is this pshat? Is this the plain sense? Obviously not. So we have a problem, or big difficulty with the text here. However, when you examine the Septuagint, and we're not going to read it in Greek, we're just going to read it in English immediately. So you would see there that the formulation is different. And God finished on the 6th day his works which he had made, and he ceased on the 7th day from all his work which he had made. So here suddenly we have a very elegant formulation. God finishes the work on the 6th day. That's the word 6, ekta. And he concludes the work and he rests on the 7th day. This is a difference that we can call a neutral difference. It has nothing to do with Judaism versus Christianity, Masoretic text as a Jewish text, and Septuagint as a Christian text. It's a neutral difference. Such differences we have many. This is the big majority of those differences, these type of neutral differences. In this particular case, which formulation would you prefer? 6 or 7? Are you going to try? Are you going to change your nusach of your kiddush when you say Vaychal Elohim bayom hashvi'i? You're going to now start saying Vaychal Elohim bayom hashishi melachto asher asa. I'm asking you. I actually have a friend who's a Bible scholar who does when he comes to visit us, he says Vaychal Elohim bayom hashishi to make a point that he feels that's the right version. I just want to point out again, we're not going to talk about this particular verse, but I just want to point out that scholars are not always convinced that we should prefer the Septuagint over the Masoretic text in this particular case, or in other cases, because sometimes scholars suggest that the difficult reading, the text that is more problematic, seems to be the original one. And there's a lot of logic in this. It makes a lot of sense, because if we had a good text, if the text actually said that God has finished his work on the 6th day and completed and rested on the 7th day, nobody would have a motivation to change that or to turn that into the 7th. So the difficult text perhaps is the original, and the Septuagint is just a reflection of somebody trying to correct or to improve a difficult text. This principle that we prefer the difficult over the easy reading is very common in scholarship, but obviously where to draw the line is always a tricky question. But in this particular case, scholars are not convinced that the Septuagint is the original reading, precisely because it makes so much more sense, and the Masoretic text poses a difficulty. So this is one example of a neutral difference. Let's talk about another example. The next example I want to bring you is from the end of the Torah. This one was from the beginning, so now we're moving to the end. In Deuteronomy 31, verse 1. So I'm reminding you how the text goes. This is in the beginning of Parashat Vayelech. In the Masoretic text, we read, Vayelech Moshe, Vaydaber et hadevarim ha'ele el kol Yisrael. Or in English, and Moses went and spoke these words unto all Israel. So this is what the text says in the Torah, in the Masoretic text. However, in the Septuagint, we find something very different. Again, if we read this, we're not going to read the Greek, we're going to read it in English translation. Over there it says, and Moses finished speaking all these words to all the children of Israel. So here it seems that the word is not Moses going, Moses went, Moshe did not, Moshe is not Vayelech, but rather he finished. So the first thing I want you to tell me is, what would you speculate the reading or the Hebrew formulation that the Septuagint is working with? How did he get to this reading? What was his Hebrew? What was the textual version in Hebrew that he's translating? How did he get to the word finished? We have Moses went, Vayelech Moshe. So can we guess what Hebrew word did he have? How did he get to this word? Can we speculate? Any ideas? I'll give you a hint. I'll give you a good hint. It has to do with the previous verse that we saw, with the verse we saw before. This one. I gave you a hint. So scholars suggest that perhaps he didn't have the word Vayelech, but rather Vayechal. Perhaps he's having the words just in a different order. Rather than having Vayelech Moshe Vav Yud Lamed Kaf, he had Vav Yud Kaf Lamed. So there, letters are reversed, and then you come to a whole new meaning, because now it's not Moses going, but rather Moses finishing to speak the words to all the people of Israel. Determining here, this is again another neutral difference. It does not involve in any way Jewish versus Christian beliefs, dogma. It's just a neutral difference. In this particular example, what would you prefer? There are advantages or disadvantages in each one of the readings. Let's talk about our version. Our version, on the one hand, Vayelech Moshe, is very problematic because it comes right after we learned in Parashat Nitzavim, in the previous portion. It starts by saying, Atem Nitzavim Hayom Kulchem Lifnei Adonai Elohechem. So Parashat Nitzavim is already describes the whole congregation joining together, standing in front of Moshe, with Moshe's presence. So why would Moshe need to go anywhere to tell these people to Israel? They're already out there. They're already with him. So our reading is very problematic, but also the Septuagint reading has its own problems. In the Septuagint, it would say, Vayechal Moshe ledaber et advarim e'ele el kol Yisrael, something like, that would sound like that in Hebrew, or in English, he finished all the words, speaking all these words to Israel. But here too, we have a problem, because what's the following verse? If you remember, Vayelech Moshe or Vayechal Moshe ledaber et advarim e'ele el kol Yisrael. But the following verse says, Vayomer alehem ben me'av esrim shana anochi hayom. He told them, I'm 120 years old today. So if he finished speaking, why would he continue speaking in the following verse? So this is a difficult case, and it's not so simple to determine which one would we prefer. And it becomes even more interesting when you think about it from a larger perspective. On the one hand, Parashat Vayelech starts with the words, with the verse I just quoted, whatever Moshe vaydaber et advarim e'ele el kol Yisrael, but it also concludes with the sentence, Vayechal Moshe ledaber et kol advarim e'ele el kol Yisrael. So we have the same precise verse, just with the word Vayechal. Some scholars prefer then to read Vayechal also at the beginning, and then see this as a some type of a circular form, that you start and end with the same particular formulation. However, other people argue, no, we should view Parashat Vayelech as an ending to Moshe's entire biography, entire life. Moshe's biography starts with Vayelech ish mibet Levi, and it makes a lot of sense that it would also end with Vayelech Moshe. And you will see there are numerous comparisons between the story of Moshe early on in his career and words that appear also in Parashat Vayelech. So this is a very fascinating case, that both readings, both formulations have a strong case, or they suffer from different problems, but also each one of these readings has its own advantages. It becomes even more interesting because in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they also found the fragment of this verse. That's what scholars at least assume. And what do you think it says? Vayelech or Vayechal? Any guesses? So at least one fragment they found says Vayechal Moshe ledaber et advarim e'ele el kol Yisrael. It's not 100% clear if it's the verse that is the beginning of Vayelech or the one at the end, so it creates more problems. But the text was also found in the Dead Sea as a fragment in one of the caves near the Dead Sea. So this is again another neutral difference, a neutral difference between Masoretic text and the Septuagint. 99.9% of the cases where we have differences separating the Masoretic text and the Septuagint are that type of differences. And again, we're talking about many of them. It's not something rare. In some few cases in the Tanakh, the differences seem to reflect different theological perspectives or ideas or principles. When the Masoretic text follows Jewish beliefs or Jewish theology, and the Septuagint seems to go along with Christian ideas. And the most famous example for this is in a prophecy that is stated in the book of Isaiah. So we'll read it first in the Hebrew, in the Masoretic text, and with the English, and then I'll tell you what the Septuagint says. In the Isaiah 7:14, we find a prophecy. This prophecy is about is stated to Achaz, that's the person who receives the prophecy, and it tells him the following. He's being told the following sentence. Just ignore the comments here. It's just from the website where I took it from, so you can ignore it. לכן ייתן אדוני הוא לכם אות. הנה העלמה הרה ויולדת בן, וקראת שמו עמנואל. Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, the young woman shall conceive and bear a son and shall call his name Immanuel. So in the Hebrew reading, this is the formulation, but now I want you to compare it to the Greek one. Everything is the same with one important difference. This is the difference in Greek or in English. Therefore, the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive in the womb and shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Immanuel. Did you see the difference? It's a tiny difference, but a very, very important difference. In this case, it's not just different, neutral different. One just reads that, the other reads the different version. It seems like we have here something much more significant. The Jewish reading is based on the word, or is using the word alma. Alma just means a young woman. As a matter of fact, it appears in our Parshat Shavua in Chayei Sarah, Hinei alma yotzet v'chadal shichma or something. So we have the word alma in our parasha, and it just means a young woman. If that's the case, it doesn't say anything about anything supernatural beyond the fact that they're being told in advance that she's about to give birth. But in the Greek tradition, the word is not alma. The word is a virgin, and virgin in the Hebrew, in the original Hebrew, has a different term for that. We don't say alma, but we say, what's the Hebrew word for virgin? No?
Betula.
Betula. That word also appears in our parasha. והנערה טובת מראה מאוד, בתולה ואיש לא ידע, in the parasha of Chayei Sarah, also with regards to Rivka. So we have a different word here. Now, this is not a neutral difference, because Christians took this word as a prophecy about Jesus, and here you see just one example from Christian art. You see, behold, the virgin shall conceive, and this is an illustration of the birth of Jesus to Mary. So here we're not talking about a neutral difference. This difference is obviously related to different theological perspectives. We find a bunch, not too many, but a bunch of verses that separate the Masoretic text and the Septuagint that also involve theological differences. And I'm not saying yet at this point which one is the better one. I'm just describing. And what I'm trying to emphasize, in some cases, the text that is the Greek translation of the Bible exposes or reveals or reflects an alternative reading that has to do something with Christian beliefs. In other cases, this case is probably a reflection of an alternative original Hebrew, meaning the translation is based on the word betula, where it's translating a different word. In some other cases, it's just a matter of interpretation. In a few places, you see that the Septuagint translates or interpret words in a way that would go along with the Christian dogma. But in this case, it's even a reflection. It seems to be reflecting an alternative original Hebrew. Rather than alma, it's a translation of the word betula. So far, I haven't said anything about battles. I just described. The reality is many, many neutral differences and a few differences that also involve Jewish, Christian, religious or theology. And this leads to the next stage. So what did people do in antiquity when they saw these differences, when they encountered these differences? What were they supposed to do? Were they supposed to prefer one reading over the other? How do you determine which one to follow, which one to adopt? So this class today will be mainly focused on Christians dealing with these differences. And we see that there are two approaches or two tendencies that happen at the same time, simultaneously. At the same time, two ways of handling these type of differences. One approach, and this is again among Christians, one way of dealing with this was to try to revise or to correct, to improve the Septuagint, to correct the Septuagint so that it would resemble the Masoretic text, that she would move or become closer to the Masoretic text. Before we explain this chart that you see here, I just want to say a word about this tendency or this approach. Why do you suppose some Christians felt that we should prefer the Masoretic text over the Septuagint? What made people feel that the Masoretic text might be more trustworthy or more reliable than the Septuagint? Why did people have that need or feeling that they need to improve or revise the Septuagint so that it resembles the Masoretic text? What could be the cause for that? Why did some Christians feel that they need to correct, improve, revise their version? I think it comes from a very natural feeling. People felt Masoretic text is composed in Hebrew, in the original language of the Bible. The Septuagint is just a translation. So when we encounter differences between these two versions, perhaps we should give some advantage to the original Hebrew over any type of translation. That was the feeling that some Christians, Christian scholars in antiquity had. And I want to emphasize this is not necessarily true, because the translation, the Greek translation, might be a reflection of an alternative Hebrew that might be more original. Nevertheless, there were some scholars back then who felt if we encounter differences that separate the Masoretic text from the Septuagint, we must give some advantage to the Masoretic text over the Septuagint and therefore correct, improve, or revise the Septuagint. Here you see one of the most famous works that were done at the beginning of the 3rd century by one of the church fathers. His name was Origen from Alexandria. And what he did was called his project is named the Hexapla. Hexapla comes from the word 6. So what did he do? This is one page or a sample from the work he has done. It only survived in very few manuscripts, but we know more or less what this work was about. What he did, what this 3rd century scholar did, he took every verse of the Torah or of the Tanakh, and he divided it into 6 columns. The first column here is the Hebrew. He put in the first column the Hebrew text of the Bible as it appears in the Masoretic text. In the next column, you see, he put the Hebrew transliteration in Greek letters, meaning it's not a translation, it's just a transliteration. So if we see here the word lemenatzeach, livnei korach, so he would put in Greek letters how it would sound in a way. He put the letters in Greek that would sound lamenatzeach, whatever way you spell it in Greek. So this is the transliteration. In the 5th column, he places the Septuagint, the text that we learned about before, the Greek translation of the Bible as it appears in the Septuagint. But in the remaining 3 columns, Aquila, Simachus, Theodotion, these are 3 revisions of the Bible, 3 Greek revisions of the Bible. And what does that mean, revisions? 3 attempts to improve or to revise the Septuagint so that it would sound more like the Masoretic text. So in this, what almost seems like a critical edition of the Bible that already existed in the 3rd century, early 3rd century, we see a very serious attempt to rethink about this dilemma, Masoretic text versus the Septuagint. And this Christian scholar is willing to introduce his readers with some attempts how to revise the Septuagint. He didn't make up these revisions. He's recording in his edition 3 existing attempts that were done by people at his time to revise, to improve the Septuagint so that it would sound more like the Masoretic text. So that's one tendency that we find in ancient times. This tendency was also in the background of another famous project that you all are familiar with, and that is the Latin translation of the Bible, or the Vulgate. In Hebrew, it's called Havulgata. The Vulgate is a Latin translation of the Bible, which also reflects a similar tendency, a feeling that one should prefer the Masoretic text over any other translation, since Jews read the Bible in Hebrew, they're working with the original text and not with a translation, and we should probably prefer that version of the Bible. In this 9th century illustration, we see the story of the Vulgate, and I'll say the story while looking at the pictures, while viewing the art, and through the art we can also tell the story. The Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible, was produced in the beginning of the 5th century by a church father, one of the church fathers named Saint Jerome. In Hebrew, we call him Hieronymus, probably the way he sounded, he would say his name as well. Saint Jerome was born in Rome. And in the top part of this illustration, you see how Saint Jerome is moving from his town in Rome, traveling probably with this boat somewhere else, to a different place. And this place that it doesn't say the name is actually in Eretz Israel, perhaps in Bethlehem. Why did Saint Jerome travel all the way from Rome to Bethlehem? Saint Jerome is a very serious scholar, and he wants to produce a new Latin translation of the Bible. But he knows that in order to do that, he must decide which versions of the Bible he's going to be using as foundation for his Latin translation. And he feels that he can't just rely on the Septuagint or on other existing translations of the Bible of his time, because there were other even Latin translations. He felt, I need to learn Hebrew, learn how to read the Masoretic text, and only then I can approach this task of translating the Bible into Latin. So what do you see here? He went all the way from Rome to Ben Gurion Airport to Bethlehem. And what is he doing here? What do you see in this illustration? Any guesses? What do you see in this tiny illustration? On the top here? Here. What is he doing? That's Saint Jerome on the left side. Who's sitting with him at the right? Okay, so here we see a Jew, a Jewish teacher, who's teaching him Hebrew. The Jew is not really supposed to be teaching this church father or Christian guy Hebrew and expose him to the sacred language. But as you can see, the Jew will do anything if you give him some money. And that's what the illustration is telling us here. So that he's paying him money, and Jews would do anything for money. So he's willing to teach his language, to his Hebrew language, to Saint Jerome. And Saint Jerome is acquiring very thorough or solid knowledge in Hebrew. After he's done with that part, he's able to move on to the next stage that you see in the second part of the illustration, and that is to start translating the Bible into Latin. But his translation is based on his Hebrew knowledge, and he too, just like we saw in Saint Origen's work, he feels that when there's a conflict between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, we should probably give some advantage to the Masoretic text, because that's the original Hebrew. The project is done eventually, and in the third part of the illustration, you see how this becomes the official translation of the Bible that was being used for many, many centuries later on. The name Vulgate means in Latin the widely spread, or the common, or the popular version, the popular translation of the Bible. So here, he, just like in the case of Saint Origen, also Saint Jerome, reflects this type of tendency, giving some preference to the Masoretic text over any other competing translation. If we wanted to examine the verses that we just spoke about, so you see that in the case of Genesis 2:1, Vayichal Elohim, he reads twice, Bayom Hashvi'i, right? You see the word septimo twice. Septimo means 7. On the 7th day, God ended his work, and also on the 7th day, he rested. Also in Deuteronomy 31:1, Moses went. Moses did not complete in Latin, but Moses went and spoke all these words to Israel. Again, following the Masoretic text. So this is what Saint Jerome is doing, following what Saint Origen is doing, with one exception. When it involves Christian theology, when it involves something that is significant from a Christian perspective, in such cases, you will probably maintain the original Christian the formulation as it appears in the Septuagint, maintaining the Christian essence or connotation of these words. So in Isaiah 7:14, he will still write Virgo, which you imagine sounds like virgin. So he keeps the word virgin and he does not change it into young woman. And here we already see these two competing or opposing tendency. On the one hand, you feel a need to revise or to improve the Septuagint so that because you feel that the Masoretic text should be treated as something more reliable. But when it comes to verses that involve Christian-Jewish tensions or theological gaps, here Christians were not so fast in revising their text. And what will happen very soon, they're not just going to maintain their text, but they will start attacking Jews. If you have a different text in such verses, your text here is not trustworthy. In such cases, Christians would attack Jews and claim you forged your Bibles. You removed certain verses or certain texts that hint or that address Christian ideas that reveal some importance for later Christianity. And this brings us finally, you're patient enough, to the battles part of the course. So far we spoke mainly about the Bibles, and now we're going to start approaching the battles between these two versions. I'm skipping one slide due to a shortage of time, and we're going to start saying a few words about the Jewish-Christian battle in general, and then we will see how it also addresses this particular theme. So a few words about the Jewish history battle in general in antiquity, and then examples that involve the Bible. So we'll say a few words about its history, the history of this Jewish-Christian conflict. We'll talk about the themes, what type of issues were common in these battles, Jewish-Christian battles. We'll talk a little bit about the literature where one can encounter these debates. And finally, we'll talk about how the Bible itself plays a role in these battles. So the first thing we need to say, we'll talk about the participants or something about the history. In antiquity, when Jews and Christians fight, they're not the only people that are part of the story. There's another element, or there's another factor that played a significant role and shaped the nature of this type of debate, and that is the Roman Empire. Starting from the debates or tensions between Jews and Christians start from day one, from the first century, and they keep going second and third century. In the first few centuries before Christianity, Christianity is not considered a legal or legitimate religion. The Roman Empire viewed Christianity as an illegal type of worship or illegal type of religion. When that was the case, Jews felt very, very comfortable to defend their own beliefs, and they were even willing to attack Christians for what they felt was their distorted ideas about Judaism or about religion in general. If you recall, in the Tfilat Shmoneh, we even have a special tefillah, a special blessing, La Malshinim Al Tikva, which was probably stated or formulated in reaction to the rise of Christianity. So in earlier stages, the nature of this type of debate was that Jews are very comfortable to respond and sometimes even to attack Christian beliefs. All that changes when we move on to the 4th century, when Christianity becomes the official, or it starts by being the a legitimate religion and the prevailing religion in the Roman Empire, in the period that we call the Byzantine, when the Roman Empire becomes the Byzantine Empire. From that point on, the dynamics change drastically. Jews from then on are not going to be able to, they're not in the state to attack or initiate any type of debates with Christians. They're only reacting in a fairly apologetic way. So the nature of the debate between Jews, Christians is very much dependent on the historical context in which this is taking place. So that was one important thing that I wanted to mention. Another thing that is important to mention is, or at least talk about, is the type of themes that often come up when Jews and Christians argue in, again, starting from very early on in the history. So here I have 4 illustrations again of 4 important themes that were common among in these Jewish-Christian debates, again, from very early on. So I'm sure you can guess some of them. Let's start. The first one, the first theme, is issues that involve the status, the role of Jesus. Is he the Son of God? Is he the Messiah? What is his role in future days? Who crucified him? All these questions are one common theme that often comes up in Jewish-Christian debates. The second one, let's see if I chose a good illustration. The second one involves what? What would that be? Not about Jesus, but I want to see if I chose a good illustration. You can get it.
Chosenness?
Right, the chosen people. Who are the chosen people? Are the Jews the chosen people, being the genetical continuation of Israel, or maybe from the time Jesus appears and later on when other people adopt his new religion, it's not really genetic descendants of Israel that are supposed to be the chosen people, but rather people who follow the path of Jesus that are becoming now the spiritual Israel and not the genetic Israel in that sense. So that's another theme that often comes up. A third issue that is very common involves the status of the laws. In Judaism, as you all know, the laws are supposed to be followed in a literal sense. As soon as Christianity emerged, in a gradual process, initially only when dealing with pagans and later on even with Jews who joined, the laws are becoming now something that one does not need to follow in a literal sense. Faith takes over the legal implications. Some of the laws are now interpreted as an allegory. You're not supposed to keep them in the literal sense, but rather in a symbolic way. For example, circumcision is a good example, but also many, many other laws. So we spoke so far about the status or the role of Jesus, the idea of chosen people, the status of the laws. But what we are concerned about is the Bible itself, and particularly the state or the accuracy of the particular biblical text itself. One more thing before we move on and provide examples, I want to talk about the type of literature where one can encounter these type of debates. Where can one find records of Jewish-Christian debates when Jews and Christians deal with these issues? Needless to say, in every Christian composition in antiquity, you find some references to Jews, some attacks on Judaism. It's a very common part of Christian theology, a very central part in Christian theology. But we're now going to be concerned with books that are solely devoted to this type of debate. There's a whole genre. People refer to it as adversus Judaeus, or anti-Jewish type of literature that emerges from very early on. And I'm talking here about books that are devoted to describe debates between Jews and Christians, written from the Christian side of things. So as I said, the title means books that are targeted or meant to fight or to argue against Judaism, against the Jews. So that's the meaning of this word. That's the meaning of this, that's the translation of this genre. One second. What does it include, this genre? We're talking about arguments against Jews presented in the form of a religious debate. In the Jewish case, we will talk about it later in the course, you will see that we have such compositions only much, much later. Books that resemble the book, like the Kuzari, I'm sure you're familiar with. But in Christianity, in the Christian case, we have many, many examples for books that include or that presented in a form of a religious debate, Jews and Christians arguing, when the Christian guy is trying to convince the Jew that he's wrong. The earliest type of books that belongs to this genre start from the 2nd century, and we'll soon read perhaps one of the earliest examples of this type of literature. Just to say, to give you a sense how many books we're talking about, scholars counted more or less about 250 compositions of this type up to the 15th century. So this is really not something rare. It's a whole genre. It's a whole it's a big, massive literature that is solely divided to these type of debates. And there are two questions that I need to ask before we read a passage for one of these debates. The first thing I want to ask you is, why did people write such books? What type of crowd was the target of these books? When they write a book that talks about the Jew and Christian arguing, trying to show that the Christian approach is the right one, who was this targeted for? We can think of two possibilities here. You either write this book to convince your opponent, meaning a Christian is writing a book trying to convince the Jews that they must convert to Christianity, or alternatively, you're writing this text inward, in other words, to your own community, to Christian audience, and you're trying to show them that their religion is the right one through by presenting a debate between a Jew and a Christian, where the Jew seems to be on the wrong side, and the Christian manages to bring evidence that he's carrying the right tradition, the right religion. So in these cases, in these books, who are they meant for? Were they meant to convince Jews to convert to Christianity, or to Christians themselves? It seems like in most cases, these books were not meant to convince Jews. They were targeted inward, meaning towards the Christian community itself. And you can tell that by the language, because the language is not written in Hebrew or Aramaic. These books were written in languages that Christians were able to comprehend, and not Jews. So that's one important thing that we need to keep in mind. The second issue that scholars deal with are these actual debates that took place, or this is just a fabricated literary device that people make up in order to describe the type of a theoretical debate between Jews and Christians. So what's the answer? The answer here is more complicated. Some debates took place. We know of there are records of some famous debates that took place between Jews and Christians. The more famous ones are the ones that comes in Paris in 1240, where Rabbi Yechiel from Paris is arguing about the status of the Talmud. That's one example. Ramban, Nachmanides, has a famous debate in Barcelona a few years later in 1263. So there are obviously some debates that took place for real, and we have records of those debates from the time. At the same time, there are probably a lot of records of debates that never took place, that are just fabricated, or literary debates that are just meant to give us a sense what would be, in theory, the type of arguments that a Jew can produce and the answers that Christians can provide, and so on. For our purposes, it doesn't really matter, because we're not really interested in historical debates. We're interested in what actually took place from a historical perspective. We're interested in the type of debates that could have taken place. We want to get exposed to the type of ideas or type of arguments that scholars might have said in such cases. And this leads us to one of the most famous records of a debate of this sort, that is already composed in the 2nd century, and is called the Dialogue with Trypho. This text was composed by Justin Martyr, a Christian martyr, and it's called the Dialogue with Trypho. So we'll say a few words about this text. Justin Martyr was a Christian from the 2nd century. He's called a martyr because he was killed by the Roman Empire due to his Christian beliefs. Again, because Christianity at that stage is not a valid or official religion. What is the meaning of the word martyr? Martyr means, what's the origin of the word? So martyr is a witness. The person is being killed for his beliefs. In that sense, he's testifying, or he's witnessing that his religion is the right religion by the very fact that he's willing to kill himself for that belief. It's the same word, by the way, that we have in Arabic in the context of Islam. When people refer to people who kill themselves, they're called shahid. Shahid is the same thing, is the same word like in Arabic, sahada, which is a witness. So both in Latin, Greek, and later in Arabic, it's the same idea. When you kill yourself for your belief, or you're willing to give your life for your belief, you're becoming a witness. You're testifying to the validity of your religion. So Justin Martyr was a martyr. He was killed by the Roman Empire for his Christian beliefs. But before he was killed, he had some dialogue. He describes in dialogue with a Jew named Trypho. Was this a real Jew? And do we know anything about him? Some scholars were suggesting that this is a real Jew from the 2nd century. They even raised the possibility that he's one of the famous sages, one of the Tanaim that appears in the Mishnah that has a similar name. If you recall, who has a name that resembles the name Trypho, we have one of the Tanaim that is called Rabbi Tarfon. There's a Chacham, there's one of the Tanaim who's named Rabbi Tarfon. So scholars even suggested, perhaps it's a real sage, it's a real Jew that he was having this debate with. Again, we're not really concerned about that now. What we really want to know is what type of arguments might have come up, were brought up in this type of conversation. It's fascinating to see that the Christian accusation that Jews have forged the Bible, when dealing with verses that involve Jewish Christian theology, appear already in the 2nd century. So very early on in this Jewish Christian debate literature, we find Christians accusing Jews of having forged their Bibles. Usually when I'm giving classes like this in the university, so I assign a Jew and a Christian to take the roles of each one of the two sides. I'm not going to ask you to do it now, but we're going to have, so what this text is a recording, is a debate or a dialogue between Justin and Trypho the Jew. And I just want to read here a few passages from the book. So here on section 66 in the book, Justin comes and he says, I want to bring you a proof from the Bible that Jesus indeed was the one that the prophets in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, were thinking about. And he says as follows. He says, I'm reading section 66. I again took up the argument at the point where originally I had stopped in my demonstration, that he was born from a virgin, and that a prophecy had been made through Isaiah that he would be born through a virgin. So Justin is introducing a proof from the Bible that the prophets were already familiar with the idea that a virgin shall conceive and bring forth a son who will be eventually Jesus. And here he brings a citation from Isaiah, the verses that we read, as they appear in the Septuagint, of course. And I added, Justin says, it is clear to everyone that no one of the physical descendants of Abraham was ever born of a virgin, or is recorded as so born, except this our Christ. So he says this text in the Bible is obviously alluding to the story of Isaiah, of Jesus. The verses in Isaiah are alluding to the story of Jesus. Answers Trypho. Trypho answered, the passage does not say, behold, the virgin shall conceive in the womb and shall bring forth a son. But behold, the young woman shall conceive in the womb and shall bring forth a son, and so on, as you said. The whole prophecy is to be applied to Hezekiah, and so on. What is the Jew saying here? What is Trypho saying? Everything you said is perfect. I love your ideas, with one tiny difference. The verse does not say anything about a virgin. It just talks about a young woman. Obviously, what he's trying to imply, and if that's the case, if the verse is not talking about a virgin, so obviously there's no evidence that it's referring to Jesus. And he concludes by saying, this is a prophecy that already took place at the time of Hezekiah, meaning sometime within the time frame of the Old Testament itself. How does Justin address this answer? So he's not happy with this answer of Trypho. And later on, I skipped a little bit, and he tells him as follows. Here, 1 second. He says, as you see, I skipped a few passages, and he says, but I do not assent to your teachers when they refuse to accept as a proper translation that which was made by the 70 elders in the reign of Ptolemy, who was the king of Egypt, but try to produce their own translations. Meaning, I realize your teachers, meaning the rabbis, are just refusing to accept the validity of the Septuagint. I would like you to realize that they have entirely removed many passages from the translations of the elders under Ptolemy, in which this same crucified man is indicated, declared directly to be God and man, and crucified and dying. So here we see, and this is the earliest record we have, that a Christian is accusing a Jew in the most direct and clear way. You Jews have forged the Bibles. There are evidence, there are different verses in the Bible where it was clear that Jesus will be the Messiah and that he's the prophecies that talk about him. And if you Jews don't have that in your biblical records, it's because you forged your text. From this point on in history, this will become a common theme. And you see that we're talking about two things that are happening simultaneously. On the one hand, when they're dealing with neutral verses, Christians were willing to reconsider the validity of the Septuagint. They were willing to correct and revise and improve their versions and to follow the Masoretic text. But when it involved these Jewish Christian charged verses, in such cases, they were not willing to abandon or to give up their tradition. And they went even a step further. They're starting accusing Jews of having forged their Bibles, of having removed passages from the Bible that declare or that show that Christianity is the right religion. I just want to conclude, mention two other verses where you can see the same thing that were also common in this type of Jewish Christian debate. So one verse, a very common verse, very known verse, is found in the book of Hosea, and it involves the word besuri, that was translated in the Septuagint as besari, my flesh. God getting a physical appearance. Again, a verse that was very charged Jewish Christian theology, and that was also a verse that was used by Christians to demonstrate how Jews forged their Bible. And finally, I just don't have time to go through each one of these verses. Finally, there's a verse, a very famous verse in Habakkuk, in the book of Habakkuk, where some Christians were even arguing that the name of Jesus appears in the Bible. In our version, in Masoretic text, we have Va'ani b'Hashem Eloza, Agila be'Elohei Yish'i. But if you see in the Vulgate, the words Elohei Yish'i are translated, but I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in God, my Jesus. They read the word Yish'i they didn't read it Yish'i as my salvation or my savior, but rather, how did they pronounce the word? How did they get to my Jesus? They probably read the word as Yeshu'i, my Jesus, my Yeshu. And from that, they concluded that Jesus appears in the Bible. That verse too was used often by Christians as an example that Jews took some verses and removed references from the Bible where Jesus was found. And this is where we're ending today's class. So far what we've seen in the first two sessions, we learned there are two important versions of the Bible, Septuagint and Masoretic text. We learned about the differences between the two. And in today's class, we learned how did people treat those differences, mainly from a Christian perspective. And we saw, on the one hand, Christians are willing to reconsider the reading of the Septuagint and to improve it so that it would resemble what the Masoretic text is saying. That's on the one hand. At the same time, when it comes to Jewish Christian heated issues, topics or words, formulations that involve Jewish Christian theology, in such cases, Jews were not willing to give up their text. And they're even starting with this common idea that will become a very common claim argument. Jews have forged the Bible. Jews removed references to Christianity or particularly Jesus from their Bibles. This is about the Jews and Christians. If you will be patient enough, next week we'll start with Islam, and you will see that the picture becomes even more interesting, and this war battle or war zone will become even more complicated when Muslims enter the picture, and that's what we will do next week. Done.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. If anyone, I think I'm happy to give a few minutes for questions. If anyone has any, has any questions for Dr. Gafni. I'm certainly looking forward to next week. Joyce?
No, I'm just saying I'm also looking forward, though I don't have any questions
Yeah.
about
No,
what
it's
was
fine. It's
today.
Well,
There's a lot of interesting stuff coming up next week. So just be patient and we'll see. Islam is a whole new ball game. It's a whole new perspective on this. So we'll speak about the Islamic approach. We'll speak about the Quran and more specifically the Islamic approach to the biblical text that we have. What's the connection between the Bible and the Quran? We'll just have to wait for that. That's a new theme for next week. And eventually we'll need to see how the Jews respond to these type of accusations that they forged their Bibles. That will wait for the coming few sessions.
all right.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Looking forward to seeing everyone next week for the 4th of 7 sessions with quite an exciting lead-in. If you want to learn more with Drisha Bisman, please check out our full class offerings on drisha.org/classes. Our next class is coming up this evening with Rabbi Wolkenfeld at 8 p.m. Have a good evening for those tuning in from Israel, a good day from those tuning in to the US, and a good morning, I guess, if you're tuning in from Australia.